have used a buy now, pay later service according to Lending Tree. And according to the Federal Reserve, people who use buy now, pay later typically have a lower credit score, they carry a balance on their credit card, and they have incurred checking account overdraft fees and have more delinquent credit card accounts. But yet, here you go. Here's more debt for you. You can buy that new jacket right now for $200 and make those 4 easy payments of $50. But if you miss one or pay us late, you're going to get hit with a fee. Also, the research is showing that consumers actually spend more when they're given the option to buy now, pay later at retail stores. So there's no doubt that more retailers are offering this option despite the heavy transaction fees. And that's why you're seeing it everywhere now, whether it's online, in store, it doesn't matter. Almost everywhere you go, unless you're buying a hot dog, you're seeing buy now, pay later. Who knows? Maybe they're even going to have it for that. And younger generations who haven't fully been through all this stuff before, they think it's cute to spend a little extra money that they don't have and finance something on a buy now, pay later loan or a credit card once in a while because times are so tough and life sucks so much right now that we need to have a little treat. You're going to buy that $5 good, you can get that $30 a month, maybe buy a $500 guitar or a $200 jacket. Don't worry, because if your bank account is low, you can always pay later. Even people who are buying houses right now are really in the danger zone when it comes to losing their house. Take a look at this. 69% of borrowers who took out a mortgage insured by the FHA last year had debt-to-income ratios that are considered risky. That's 70% of people who are getting FHA loans considered a risky bet due to them having too much debt already. And the qualification requirements for FHA are abysmal, guys. And you only have to have like a 520 credit score, maybe it's 580, I can't remember. The income requirements are extremely low. You only got to put a 3.5% down payment. Sometimes you can even qualify for 0% down payment depending on what other programs are available. It is a joke. And I'm sorry to say it like this, but everybody who's falling for this right now, is jumping on that bandwagon, overextending themselves to get a house, they kind of deserve to lose it. Because people need to learn lessons the hard way. They need to learn that it's not that easy. You're not just going to get an FHA loan from the government, have all this other debt, and just be able to somehow survive and make it, and keep paying for everything with another credit card. It doesn't work that way, especially with a house payment. You're going to pay the credit card for someone else. There's no buy now, pay later option for the mortgage payment, or the property taxes, or the insurance. It's already a known fact that the government, Fannie Mae, and Freddie Mac are buying down the mortgage rates of the distressed borrowers to prevent a massive wave of foreclosures right now. So a lot of this housing is actually being subsidized with your money. According to data, the FHA has raised or reduced monthly payments on nearly 1.2 million mortgages over the past 2 years, which is about 15% of its portfolio. And without that forgiveness, the delinquencies would be near the levels that we saw during 2008 and 2009. So everything is just being completely artificially propped up, and they don't want you to see what's going on. Because if you were to see it, everybody would be completely in shock of where things are at right now. We've also seen a surge in margin borrowing this year. This is when investors borrow money to buy stocks. That has surged this year due to the market exuberance that we've been seeing. And retail traders can borrow at rates as low as 5.75% right now on Robinhood to buy and trade stocks. But if the market goes south all of a sudden, these people are going to lose their shirts. Meanwhile, you got companies who are raising money by piling on debt. They're issuing junk bonds, essentially, and investors right now are demanding less of a premium to buy risky debt because there's so much inflation chasing everything out there. Some companies are also borrowing money in order to pay for the tariff. Others are borrowing to pay dividends or buy back shares to boost their own stock prices. So buy now, pay later, guys. That seems to be the new American way for everything. But it's really going to turn into buy now, pay never when everybody goes bust. And who's going to be footing the bill in the end? That's what I want to know. I think we all know the answer to that. No. One other thing I want to mention here that's kind of related to all this is a story that was sent to me is how a big Camping World store in Escanaba, Michigan is closing. And it's kind of ironic because, you would think that camping stores would be booming right now, with everybody's moving into an RV or tent these days just to be able to keep up with the cost of living. But even that's not really happening to the level to keep these places in business. And this was the only RV service center in the area, and now somebody has a repair or a breakdown. People have to drive over 100 miles to the next nearest store. The other thing you got to think about is RV sales in particular are really tied to disposable income in this country and consumer confidence and where things are going. And RV sales are going nowhere but down. This is a clear sign that people are cutting back on the luxuries of life. You know, with the high inflation, with the high fuel costs, and probably insurance costs, and certainly insurance on these RVs is insane as well. And the upkeep and the maintenance, no one can afford that right now. But they should just switch their business model to just selling nothing but tents, guys. They probably would have made a killing. I always see comments from people saying that you should invest in the tent companies right now. You do what you will with that information. So I hope anybody who finds themselves unemployed in the near future, or maybe you're already unemployed watching this now, gets a little bit of inspiration on kind of what it takes.
We've wasted trillions and trillions on unprofitable wars of intervention that have brought us nothing but grief, and Europe nothing but an invasion of people that they don't want and can't maintain. So at some point, somebody in Europe, and I think Orban is leading the charge in this, but I think the rest of it are wake up and say this is a dead end, especially when it becomes clear that the Russians are not interested in marching all the way to the Polish border. Not to say that they won't do it if they're forced into it, but the bottom line is that's not what they've been about. They've never been about, well, we just want to capture more and more territory. Russia is already the largest country in the world. How much more territory do they need? And I think the answer is not much. But they've effectively reconquered or retaken or re-annexed what was New Russia under Catherine the Great. That's something that made sense because the people that live in those areas are Russians culturally, linguistically. They're happy to do that. We don't seem to want to recognize any of that. We seem to want to maintain this artificial construct called the Cold War in new form. It's a dead end. It's not going to work. And I think the Europeans who are now approaching a depression, frankly, total destruction in industrial and scientific terms, are simply going to wake up, put new people into power. They're coming. It doesn't matter how hard Merz tries to keep the alternative for Germany out of power. It doesn't make any difference. They're going to come to power. And when they come to power, they're going to reverse all of this. And the first place they're going to go is Moscow. They're going to have a meeting right away. And they're going to throw out all this nonsense. And you're going to see the Germans march out of NATO at high speeds. And remember that one of the arguments for all of this nonsense was we have to keep the Germans in NATO. That's part of the rationale for hostility to Russia, because that means Germans and Russians won't cooperate. And if Germans and Russians don't cooperate, we can live with the status quo in Washington in perpetuity. Everyone is vassalized in subordination to us. All of this is failing. It's all going to collapse.
You know, you mentioned this Cold War mentality and even a lust, if I can use that term, to go back to the Cold War mentality, go forward into a new one. One of the ways that the current leadership, they may get out of power one day, but not yet. And these guys that are in power keep talking about this coalition of the willing, or this reassurance force, and they keep going down this path, and they still are to this day trying to get Trump to agree to, not only agree to it, but to participate in it with some kind of, whether it's air support, logistics, etc. They keep saying, hey, whenever this is brought to some kind of negotiation, we want our troops in this demilitarized zone and so forth, which is odd because if you have military there, it's not a demilitarized zone, but nevertheless, they want those in there. Well, Putin, again, being very plain and plain spoken, but a couple of days ago, that ain't happening.
If some troops appear there, especially now while the fightings continue, we proceed from the premise that these will be legitimate targets for destruction.
And you can see that venue thought that was a really good idea, that they would be destroyed. So that's not something that would scare a lot of Russians there. Many of them are actually pushing more aggressively in that path now. What does that tell you about the state of affairs and the likelihood that this war can come to any kind of conclusion soon?
first is the use of this terminology, coalition of the willing. This goes back to the 1990s. Almost immediately after the Soviet state collapsed and the Warsaw Pact was dissolved, there were people in Europe that were happy to be part of NATO, but they saw NATO as being exclusively defensive. And so when Yugoslav civil war peaked, and we made the decision to exploit the confusion in Yugoslavia by attacking the Serbs, whom we blamed, rightly or wrongly, for everything that was wrong in Yugoslavia and in the Balkans, you immediately had to turn to this new phrase, coalition of the willing, because most of your alliance members were not interested in going to war with the Serbs. In other words, they weren't interested in a military intervention and sustaining it. So we held these meetings to get people on board to supply troops, to provide resources. And many members would say, okay, well, we'll ship you some trucks, we'll send a medical support team, but we don't want any soldiers involved. We have to understand that the notion of a coalition of the willing within the framework of the NATO alliance is an expression of weakness, not strength. I mean, if you're trying to convey the impression to the Russians that you had this enormously powerful alliance that stands to destroy them or defeat them if they refuse to do whatever it is you want them to do, and you turn around and say, "Oops, so wait a minute, well, we really have a coalition of the willing," and that means, the French and British armies that together, they're actually meaningless as a Hellenic concept. They're just not meaningful forces. And oh, by the way, well, the Germans are now going to spend money. Well, they're going to spend money, but German nationalists inside the German army, people that are fed up with the terrible leadership in Berlin, are now being driven out of the army. Well, if you're going to drive nationalists out of the army, you're not going to have an army. All of us who serve in uniform by definition a nationalist. So the whole thing is a catastrophe. There's no chance of success. And the idea that some portion of Ukraine could be occupied by the so-called coalition of willing is rightly dismissed out of hand by Putin, because why are the Russians fighting? They are fighting to prevent adjacent territory from being occupied by foreign forces that are hostile to Russia. Now, if that's the raison d'etre for the war, why would anyone think that you could pick a piece of Ukraine, whatever is left over, and say, well, we'll settle for this. So we have our toe in the pond, we can say we own the port, still own a portion of the pond. It's meaningless, it's stupid, it's unacceptable. But that's
and let me ask you, just on the logic of it, because we to the Western audience, it does sound tough. It's, man, we're going to put these combat troops in there, and that's going to be a real deterrent. That's going to keep troops from going further, and it will serve as a deterrent for them to do that in the future. But then one has to ask, and I think that the Russians are very keenly aware of this, is that if you're not willing to fight for Ukraine today, why do you think that they would be willing to fight and die for Ukraine tomorrow? I don't understand the logic of that.
Well, this has always been the issue. The real question, I think it was Anatol Lieber who raised the issue. He said, this will be decided by the people who are willing to fight. In other words, the Ukraine war. He said, now the Ukrainians are willing to fight. Well, what about everybody else in NATO? And that answer was, well, not so much. And the one nation that sent forces over there, swore allegiance to the Ukrainian state, and died in great numbers for the Ukrainian state, were the Poles. And now the Poles, at least, have sobered up to the extent that the new president says there will be no more Polish soldiers in Ukraine. Well, that's a good thing. But in the final analysis, your point is accurate. Nobody's interested in dying in Ukraine. People in France or Germany or Austria or any of these other countries, have no interest in marching 1,000 miles east in order to come to grips with the Russian army. And what a dumb idea. That's the biggest mistake you can possibly make. So, it's shadow war. That means that it's up to President Putin, his inner circle, to make the decision. I think we're seeing the beginning of that with this punishing strike. I think they're going to go after all of the targets of command and control, which means the people who are in charge over Ukraine. And I think they're going to start moving further west. Now, will they go all the way up to the river and stop? I don't know. But if you talk in terms of creating neutral zones,
Where are you going?
zones, the Russians will have to go through because they won't accept it. You know, that's sort of like saying, well, we just fought a war in Mexico, and northern Mexico is going to be a neutral zone. No one is there, and it'll have its own independent government. And central Mexico, well, that's going to be something else. We're not really sure what it is yet, but it could be, you know, have the presence of foreign forces. And it's crazy. We would never accept that. Why would the Russians do it? But we need to be honest. What we need to be honest means the premise of the war itself was always stupid. It was never correct. It was never necessary. We created this mess, but I'm serious. Washington. If you pull us out of this equation, it's over. And President Trump should understand that. But